Okay, in our last session, have you ever gotten to the point it's like, oh yeah, by the way, you need to remember this and this? So I want to hit a couple of areas. I want to talk about some perils. There's some dangers in leadership. We're going to talk a little bit about developing yourself as a leader. And then we're going to finish up with talking about this concept of succession, because that's extremely important. Okay, leaders. Are they much different? Does God give them special dispensation that they're not going to face the problems that everyone else faces? In fact, based on what we've talked about, they're probably going to face more problems because the devil is going to take pot shots at them. Satan's temptation of Jesus in the wilderness. There's sort of three main areas of temptation. Number one is the physical desires, lust, materialism, and greed. The devil said, command these stones to be bread. There's mental desires, sensationalism, popularity, and fame. The devil tried to get Christ to cast himself down off the pinnacle of the temple. And then spiritual desires, power, control, and self-will. So those are areas, three main areas, and that's reinforced if you look over in 1 John, because he talks about the lust of the flesh. Again, that's physical pleasures, desires, immorality. The lust of the eyes, riches, greed, extravagance, and the pride of life. Now, there's a whole host of potential problems, perils that we could talk about for leaders. But I've singled out four that typically I've found in my experience to be leaders are particularly susceptible to. And the first one is pride. Now, I'll give you an example out of each of these. Nebuchadnezzar, a very prideful man. He made the mistake of bragging, saying, look what I've done. And God put him out in the field for a few years. But pride, and of course this was sort of the basis for the fall of Lucifer. But pride exhibits itself in a lot of different ways. Let me just give you a few. One is egotism. Or self-focus. It leads us to take credit for what God has done as well as for what a leader's followers have done. Now, sometimes egotism, there's versions of egotism that are quite subtle and don't seem as damaging, but yet it's egotism. And one is self-focus. You're so busy in what you're doing that you don't have time to see what God's doing. And you just keep getting busier and busier. What does that mean? Typically you're losing your relationship with people. You can lose the heart level because it's not so much you're doing it for yourself, but you're self-focused. You're only consumed with what you're doing, not with the big picture. Jealousy. Now, we wouldn't see this in corporations and churches, would we? Corporations, they call it turf battle. In churches, it's more like just misunderstandings. But leaders get jealous about what other leaders are doing. Popularity. Example of that is over in 1 Corinthians where the church was divided. It says, I'm of Paul and I'm of Apollos. Paul had to explain to them, it's not about me, it's not about Apollos, it's Christ. And popularity can be really seductive as a leader, and you move from the focus of pleasing God to pleasing people. Easy to do, a lot of pressure there. Infallibility. Lord Acton number of years ago, and it's been repeated several times, made this statement: power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. We can become infallible. In other words, I'm the leader, and so I don't really make mistakes. Big problem. Indispensability. As a leader, sometimes we take this: no one can do this but me. Well, guess what? If we're carrying out God's objectives, there's probably any number of people that could do this. So, how do you correct that? Refer back to a book by J. Oswald Sanders in his book Spiritual Leadership. He says, here's a good way to check for pride, and he calls it a test of precedence. In other words, how does it affect you when other people are more successful than you are? Are you happy for them? Are you jealous? Are you sad? Here's another test. Test of sincerity. Are you willing to admit your failures? You know, I had a particular manager that worked for me one time. He was really, really good. But he just couldn't stand to be wrong. And so he would rationalize and, look, folks, when you're wrong, everybody knows you're wrong. Admit it. You need to do that. I can remember once a crowning moment. I was charged with developing a corporate university. And we were at our training center. And I mean, it was a really nice training center. And had a big sort of amphitheater type. I mean, you know, went around and staggered and had all the people that I had recruited, sort of the best and the brightest, to come into the training center, and we were going to talk about what we were going to do. And so I was standing up there like this, and I was talking with them about how important it was and what we were going to do, and I looked down, my pants were unzipped. And so I walked over and sort of got behind the lectern and zipped my pants, and I said, well, I guess you're really impressed now. You got a leader that can't even remember to zip his pants up. But as a leader, if you're willing to admit faults, that increases credibility. Because when you make a mistake and you don't own up to it, you lose credibility. So you need to understand that as a leader. And then this test of criticism. Can you accept criticism? Or do you go on the defense? In Proverbs it says that a man that can accept criticism is wise, and you have a chance to improve. So that's one major peril. And we're going to go through these a little more rapidly maybe than would like. A major peril is for a leader is sexual immorality. This really plagued David. I mean, it was horrible effect on his ministry and on his life. And you can just think back, I won't call names, but you can think of whether it's the corporate world, whether it's the church world, of leaders who have fallen because of their immorality. The consequences. Quite frequently we do not understand, or we do not really absorb the understanding of what are the consequences of this. David, for example, do you really understand? What we tend to do with David is, oh yeah, he had this thing with Bathsheba, and then the prophet came in, and he was, finally confessed, and then he made it right, and all was good. No, it wasn't. Let me tell you just what happened in David's life. Look at this. The child conceived by David and Bathsheba died. David pled and begged, but the child died. David had a daughter named Tamar who was raped by her half-brother, Amnon. Then Amnon was murdered by another one of David's sons, Absalom. And then Absalom had to flee. And David grieved over that. And then Absalom returned. And you'd think, well, things are looking up. Well, not quite, because Absalom led a revolt. And he did something that was completely unheard of. To completely disgrace David, Absalom had intercourse with David's concubines in full view of Israel, to completely discredit David. And then finally, Joab killed Absalom. So, was everything okay with David? No, there were consequences. And in leadership, and I want to emphasize that no leader is immune to this. Now, when we go through this, looking at some of the things, okay, what do you do? It's sort of written from a male perspective, but I want to add to that a female perspective, because are females subject to this peril? You bet. It's different, a little different now, because God created men and women differently, but men tend to be, the major peril is the physical attraction. The typical peril for women is the emotional attraction. So let's look at that. How would you try to make yourself immune? Number one, invest in time and effort in your spouse, wife or husband. Spend that time. Number two, establish and maintain, particularly if we're talking about area of sexuality, maintain a loving sexual relationship with your spouse, husband and wife. Three, make a commitment to God and self not to commit adultery, mental adultery. You say, well, that's only a man thing. No. Let me get on thin ice here. There's such a thing as emotional pornography. Men may get into visual pornography, but women can get into emotional pornography. What does emotional pornography look like? Soap operas? Who's that appeal to? I'm just saying, you need to be careful. Be accountable to God and one or two godly people. It's great to have an accountability partner that's going to ask you the right questions. Be cautious about, and this is different for men and women, but for men, be very cautious about what you see. With women, be very cautious about this emotional connection. Now, what would this emotional connection look like? It's having a lot of deep conversations about problems, sharing intimate details with problems, confiding in someone of the opposite sex. And that leads to guard against being alone one-on-one with someone of the opposite sex. This I know this sounds awfully straight-laced, but let me tell you this. God made men and women in relationship. As that relationship gets stronger and stronger, it moves ultimately to the ultimate intimacy and relationship of sexuality. Now, does that mean that that's automatically going to happen? No. I'm just going to say, look down the road, that can happen. The mechanism's different. With men, it's more physical. With women, it's more emotional. And then place a spiritual hedge of protection around your marriage through prayer. Here's another one. Burnout. Leaders are susceptible to burnout. H.B. London, who works a lot with pastors, and this burnout is not just in the corporate world, but it's really prevalent in ministerial ranks. H.B. London says 45% of pastors say that they have experienced depression or burnout to the extent that they needed to take a leave of absence from the ministry. I talked to a gentleman named Doug File, who is director of missionary care services in Colorado Springs, Colorado. And I was asking him basically What do you see in missionary families that maybe is different from other families? And he said this one thing. He says that burnout is the most common problem within the missionary community. So burnout is real, folks. It's and it's for leaders. What's the cause of burnout? Is probably the most difficult to admit and discuss. It's not a function of spiritual maturity, mental toughness, or physical stamina. And particularly in the church world, there's, if I'm spiritual enough, then I won't get burned out. Well, no connection. You can get burned out. But basically, it's an unbalanced life, and I've been there, and I know some of you possibly have been into burnout. But what is it? It's a state of complete physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual exhaustion. What would that look like? Sleeplessness, usually exhibited by going to sleep, waking up a few hours later, can't go back to sleep. A sense of hopelessness that can't be linked to anything particular. And a loss of interest in the ministry or loss of interest in your job. Anxiety over small or unidentifiable issues with a loss of self-confidence. An unidentifiable sense of fear or impending doom. This is sort of scary stuff. And maybe it's hard to imagine it unless you've been there. But if you've been there, then you understand what this is. Frequent, uncontrollable weeping. You say, a man would weep? Yep. Do women go through burnout? Sure. But typically, women will do something about it long before men will. But that's starting to change because we're trying to force women now into the same mold as men. And so you're starting to see more burnout with women also. How about an example from the Bible on that? Elijah is a great example of that. If you look over in 1 Kings, here's God's man, a tremendous victory on Mount Carmel, withstood all of the prophets of Baal, scoffed at them, and here, not too much time later, he's sitting out in the wilderness saying, God, kill me. Take me. I've had enough. Why? How did he get from there, the peak, down to the valley? Well, let me show you sort of how that might happen. It's called overexertion over an extended period of time in all three areas: spiritual, mental, emotional, and physical realm. In the physical realm, look at Elijah. He'd been in a period of intense prayer and ministry, and a period of spiritual opposition on Mount Carmel. A lot of stress, man. He was God's man. He was the only one against all of these others. A lot of stress. Mental and emotionally, he had withstood those 450 prophets. And now then, Jezebel said, enjoy it, because I'm going to kill you. Physically, before this, he had been through a famine with just a sufficient amount of food, but now he was running from Jezebel. And if you read in there, it says he ran all the way from Mount Carmel to Jezreel. I mean, talking about a marathon. I mean, he was running. And that's how he got. He just kept doing. You know, a phrase is, if you keep doing what you're doing, you keep getting what you're getting. In other words, you're going to have to change something. And that's pretty hard as a leader. Well, I can't afford to. I've got all these responsibilities. I can't do that. Well, look at the solution for Elijah. What did Elijah do? Or I guess a better phrase is, what did God do for Elijah? He put him to sleep. Woke him up, fed him. put him back to sleep. In other words, typically in burnout, you're going to have to address the physical aspect of it first. Because if you don't get the rest and nourishment, it's going to be hard to work on the mental, emotional, and spiritual. And this is what God did for him first. Now, a point there. It may mean that you're in such a state of burnout or even on toward clinical depression that it may take some type of intervention. I mean, it may take something for you to sleep, or it may take some other medication to get you headed back the right way. I know my son went through burnout. He was doing a surgery residency at Baylor, and he was working 120 hours a week. And he did that for about 2 years. And then he thought he would hopefully take a break, and he would do a rotation to Tenwick Hospital in Kenya. And he thought, well, I'll get over there. Well, we got over there, and they loaded him up with surgeries. He thought, okay, when I get back, I'll get some rest. When he came back, they made him chief resident. And it just burned him out. And it took changing some things. He had to move out of that residency for a while. And so you're going to have to change what you're doing. It may be painful, and you may think, there's no way I could do that, but you're going to have to. You're going to have to start with the physical. Once he started with the physical and started getting a little bit of rest, then God was able to deal with him. That's when he had that time alone with God. And notice what Elijah did, or what God allowed Elijah to do. He allowed Elijah to vent his frustration. Now, I know you've never been there. You've never been to the point of, God, it's just me. I'm the only one, and all these other people, they just won't do right, or they won't help me. What did God tell Elijah? He said, listen, I've got folks that you don't even know about. But God didn't tell him that to start with, because Elijah wasn't at a point to receive it. He had to get some rest. He had to get physically recharged. Then it started in the emotional and in the spiritual recharging. His perspective changed. He started to realize, hey, God, it's not all on my shoulders. I'm just doing what you ask me to do. I'm going to rely on you more. And then, have you ever noticed when you get to that point, where's your focus? On all these other people? No, it's on yourself. And the more you focus on yourself and how tired you are and how you're worn down, the worse it gets. But what started to happen and this is a part of the process of digging out of burnout, but it's you have to get through some of the physical renewal and some of the mental, emotional renewal to get to the point you can start focusing on other people. And so, was that the end of Elijah's ministry? If you track it, his ministry was even greater after that. When he left there, he anointed 2 kings and 1 prophet. So, burnout, if you go through it, it's not the end. It has a significant impact on you. But it's not the end. So, how do you not get there? The best way to not get there is to do the same things that you would do if you were in burnout. In other words, have a balanced life. Physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. Get it balanced. It's much better to have preventative maintenance than mitigation. In other words, it's better to fix it before it breaks rather than fixing it after it breaks. And that's with yourself. Here's another peril, and this probably with leaders, and yes, this happens in ministry. It's the most distressing peril that I see, and that is family neglect. There's a tendency to neglect families, males, females, husbands, wives, dads, moms. We can get so busy doing the good things that we neglect the best things. A great little book I would recommend that you read sometime is called The Tyranny of the Urgent. Help you sort of get your perspective on things. Just a small little book. But let me give you an example of neglect. Someone you've probably never heard of before. A gentleman by the name of Jephthah. He was a judge. And the interesting thing about Jephthah is that he, in the name of his ministry, he destroyed his ministry, destroyed his family, destroyed his life. Here's what it looked like. Jephthah was called to the noble cause of rescuing Israel from the Ammonites. Find that in Judges chapter 11. You can find this in Judges 11 and 12. Second, he was ordained. He was set aside for this great task. 3, he became so focused on defeating the Ammonites that he sacrificed his family on the altar of success. How did he do that? Jephthah prayed to God. He said, God, if you will allow me to be victorious, then when I return, the first person I see, I will sacrifice to you. Who's the first person he saw? He saw his daughter. Now, you can argue about whether it was a literal, actual sacrifice. More than likely, it was take that person and set them aside to be a virgin and be dedicated to the Lord, so he would lose his lineage. But what he did was he was victorious, but then he lost his family. And I used to worry about that. Well, why would God require that? And then finally one day it dawned on me. God didn't require it. He never required it. Jephthah said, I will. So, how does that look in our world? It means that you can put all your attention and focus on your job, on your career, yes, even in the ministry, to the detriment of your family. Jephthah was successful. He had a victory. But he lost his family. And he died a broken man. So, God doesn't require that. And what I would say is this. Too many leaders have become focused on vision and objectives to the neglect of their family. As a result, they lose their ministry and their families. Let me tell you something I've seen over 30 years in the church world and the corporate world. Let me tell you one thing I've heard and one thing I've never heard. Here's what I've heard several times. I can remember standing in a work center out in the parking lot, and a senior lineman. He was a man's man. I mean, he was muscular. He would wear his shirt unbuttoned all the way down here, and he had gold chains, and he took great pride, and he was a man's man. I saw that man cry that day. He said, Larry, my goal was to work all the overtime I could work, be the best employee I could be, so that I could build up and retire early. And he said, you know, it wasn't worth it because I lost my family. And I've seen vice presidents do the same thing. I've seen presidents and CEOs do the same thing. And they've all said, I paid the price. I sacrificed my family. And they didn't phrase it this way, but sacrificed my family on the altar of success. Here's something I've never heard. I've never heard. At the end of a career, I've never heard someone say, you know, Larry, I just spent too much time with my family. I wish I'd spent more time with the corporation, then I would have been higher up. I've never heard that. Because in the end, you start to distinguish and sort out what's truly important. Let me give you a thought. Fast forward to your funeral. Who's going to be there? Who's going to be there? If you're a minister, maybe if it's the church where you are then, maybe a fairly good turnout. Churches you've pastored in the past, maybe a few people. Hopefully your family will be there. Hopefully they'll be there. That's what's important. I took an early retirement to be full-time in doing what I'm doing. And you know, when at my funeral, there will probably be very few people from my corporation there. Because by this time they've forgotten who I was. But I hope my family's there. And I hope people that I've invested my life in are there. Because you see, it's important. You don't need to get your priorities out of whack. What are your priorities? God first, your spouse second, your kids next, and then everything else falls below that. And I want to emphasize this in the church world. Ministry and family are not incompatible. God does not call a man or a woman into ministry to neglect their family. Now, let's talk about developing as a leader. There's two phases to development of leadership. One is developing yourself and then developing others. Henry Blackaby makes this statement: the best thing leaders can do for their organization is to grow personally. And if I were going to use an example of someone developing their leadership skills, it would be Joseph. Because Joseph started out, if anybody had a right to say, I've been mistreated, and hunker down and get bitter on life, it was Joseph. And had he done that, Joseph wouldn't have ended up where he ended up. Because Joseph developed himself all along. He got some good news and bad news. The good news is that God called a person to be a leader. Bad news is that you can't do it in your own strength, and it's not going to happen overnight. John Maxwell gives an account of an event. Said he was speaking, and a young man came up and asked him this question: what's the most important requirement to becoming a leader? And Maxwell said, it's hard work. And the young man said, well, what's the second most important? In other words, I want to be there, but I don't want to pay the price. As a leader, if you want to be a leader, you're going to have to develop as a leader. It takes a lot of work. Again, talking about John Maxwell, he talks about 4 phases of leadership, and I've seen this and I can relate to it. Phase 1 is I don't know what I don't know. This is like the first time someone goes into a supervisory position, and man, this is where I want to tell folks what to do now. They've been telling me what to do. In other words, they don't know what they don't know. Or this may be that first pastorate for someone out of seminary, and they don't know what they don't know. And then they run into this buzzsaw. Depending on your particular denomination, it may be elders, it may be deacons, it may be other leaders in the church. And typically at that point, the only thing you can do is step back and say, Lord, protect them. Don't let it be anything fatal. But they're going to have to learn some things. And they have to learn some things to get to this second step. And that's phase 2 is I don't know, or I know what I don't know. Now that's a teachable moment. And typically that's when people come in with their tail tucked between their legs because they've experienced some bad situations. I know I had one young supervisor once, went into it, and he was going to tell people what to do, and he didn't know what to do, but that didn't daunt him. And so people would take great glee in letting him move way out on that limb, and they'd saw it off every time. And I talked to him, but I finally had to get his group together. I said, folks, you're going to have to cut him some slack. I know he's coming across arrogant, but it's because of insecurity. You're going to have to help him. I'm going to help him. You need to help him. But he had to get to this point that you know what you don't know. And then finally, it gets a little better. You grow and know, and it starts to show. This is where you're truly in the student phase. It's like, okay, now then I want to start learning, and hey, some of this stuff works. And then finally that last phase, and honestly, not many people get there. I don't think I will get there, and I simply go because of what I know. In other words, leadership skills become automatic, and it just works. Now, how do you get through these different levels? You've got to be proactive. If you're waiting for someone to train and teach you and take the responsibility to make a leader out of you, you'll never be a leader. You have to intentionally, on purpose, develop yourself as a leader. And there's growth in 5 different areas. Oswald Sanders says, J. Oswald Sanders says, there's no such thing as a self-made spiritual leader. I would go so far as to say there's no such thing as a self-made leader, period. It takes a lot of work. It starts with a relationship. They've got to establish that relationship with God. And remember I told you in a previous session, leadership is about relationships. You've got to have those relationships. It's about knowledge. There's all kinds of information out there. And what I've tried to do is show you what's in the Bible. But also, what I've given you is a resource list in the back. And this is a starter list. These are some of the books that I would highly recommend to you. And if you notice, number 1 up there is the Bible. But there's some other really good books that I would recommend. And I would encourage you to take the initiative to do that. And then it takes work. You've got to, what you practice, you've got, or what you learn, you've got to practice. You've got to sacrifice. Be honest. As a leader, you're going to have to give up some of your free time. Now, I'm not talking about sacrificing your family. I'm talking about maybe some things you'd rather be doing, but instead, and let me commend you. There's a lot of things you could be doing this Saturday morning. Let me commend you for wanting to spend some time to learn what the Bible says about leadership. And then experience. Some things you can learn, you can try, but if you haven't experienced it, you're not going to develop and grow into it. I love a statement by Winston Churchill. He says, success is going from failure to failure without loss of enthusiasm. In other words, there's going to be some failures as a leader. You know, I can look back and think, like, what was I thinking? Maybe some people I hired, or maybe it was some things that I said, or more often things that I didn't say that I should have said. Just one thing in this area, you can quote me on this, and that is never waste a good mistake. You've already paid for it, so don't repeat it. It's different. Make a mistake and learn from it and change than to make the mistake and then turn around and make that mistake over and over and over again. Never waste a good mistake. They are expensive, but they're very valuable in your development as a leader. Now, let me jump over to, not only does a leader, are they responsible for developing themselves, but they need to develop others. This is a firm conviction of mine, and that is developing other leaders is the main function of a leader. Did you hear me? Developing other leaders is the main function of a leader. Why? Because no organization is going to grow, no organization is going to be effective until you develop other leaders. And who's going to develop leaders? People that aren't leaders? No, it's people who are leaders. That's why I challenge you as a leader to intentionally, on purpose, invest your life in teaching and training others to lead. Why do organizations, whether it's a church or corporation or an individual business, why does it stop growing? They don't have leaders. They have no leadership. No one in the ranks. Delegation and empowering of a leader's empowerment and leverage a leader's effectiveness. Remember that chart we looked at earlier? How delegating leverages your abilities? Let me tell you this. If that would increase it 10 times or 100 times, leveraging, developing other leaders would make it 1,000 times more effective. You've got to invest in other people. This is the number one key. I'm convinced that churches don't grow. It's not because they don't have a good leader at the top. It's because they don't have other leaders they're developing. So, this is probably one thing that a leader cannot delegate, and that's delegate training other leaders. Now, don't get me wrong. You as a leader invest in leaders. They in turn should be investing in other people too. But that first level, people that report to you or people that working with you, that you have some oversight on, you need to spend time developing those people. It's crucial. How do you do that? This works whether it's corporate, works whether it's in the home. It's called mentoring. And the basis of that is 2 Timothy 2:2. And it says, "And the things that thou hast heard of me among many witnesses, the same commit thou to faithful men, who shall be able to teach others also." Paul talking to Timothy. Paul taught Timothy. And he says, "Timothy, you teach other men, who in turn teach other men." That's mentoring. Some biblical examples of that. Moses and Joshua, a great illustration of mentoring. Naomi and Ruth, Elijah and Elisha, Barnabas and Saul, Paul and Timothy. If I were going to pick an example to use for mentoring, I'd pick Christ. He took 12 men, invested his life in them. How many men did Christ mentor? Not a trick question. 12, right? How many people can you mentor? Can't be a whole bunch of people. I would go so far as to say it's probably at best a handful. If Christ could do 12 and one of them turned out to be rotten, best you can do is much less than that. So you need to understand that. A survey by Maxwell states that 80% of leaders attribute their development to being mentored by another leader. A book I would recommend to you is a book called Iron Sharpens Iron by Howard Hendricks. A great book on mentoring. What did Christ do as the ultimate mentor? Selected men with leadership qualifications. When you look at mentoring someone, be selective. You can't mentor everyone. You can only mentor a few. So look at people that have the potential. It's important. You need to be selective. Number 2, what did Christ do? He chose very selective. He chose 12 people. And then he was very intentional and methodical in the teaching. He used parables, he used questions, and he did his best. Model leadership principles before your protege or the one you're mentoring consistently. And they need to see those biblical principles and applications in action. Why did Christ wash his disciples' feet? Because they couldn't do it? No, he used it. He only did it once. He did it to show them humility. And so you need to model that. You need to hold your proteges accountable because they need to be coached. And then commission the protege as a leader. And what? Give them authority to develop other leaders. Now, let me, what does this look like? Every person needs to have a Paul. In other words, someone that mentors you. You can seek those people out, people that you would like to be like, and say, hey, I want to learn from you. Would you spend some time with me? Maybe once a month, maybe whatever you can work out, but learn from that person. And then you need a Barnabas. Who is that? That's a peer. That's someone that will get in your face, that will hold you accountable, that's not willing, that's not bashful about saying, you're messing up with your wife, or you're messing up with your kids, or do you realize what you're doing wrong? Or, man, you've done a good job in this area or that area. A peer, someone that can hold you accountable. And then you need a Timothy. You need someone to invest your life in. Now, for example, you say, well, I'm a young enough leader, and I'm 18 years old, and who can I mentor? You can minister teenagers, tweens. There's always someone that you can mentor. And do you know what? Particularly down that age, nothing a young boy or a young girl would like more so than someone who's cool to mentor them. Now, they won't know what mentoring is, but you can do that. Now, I want to finish up what we've covered over these 5 sessions. And this is sort of bittersweet, but it's true. And it's succession. What's going to happen when you're gone? And this is a true statement, that there is no success without succession. You've seen the good and the bad of that with Israel. You've seen some good succession and some bad succession. Let's look at the good succession to start with. And one example I'd like to use is Moses and Joshua. Joshua was mentored by Moses. He was prepared by Moses. Max Dupree in his book makes this statement: succession is one of the key responsibilities of leadership. So, is leadership succession inevitable? It's going to happen, right? In other words, you're not immortal. I'm not immortal. At some point, we're going to be gone. It may be God calls you to another location. Maybe God calls you home. But it's inevitable. It's going to happen. And the question is, what's going to happen when that happens? Is everything going to fall apart, or is it going to go on? Leadership succession is the changing of God's appointed leader only. The vision is revealed, but God does not change. Example with Moses and Joshua. What was God's vision? What was his objective? It was to move the Israelites out of Egypt to the promised land, establish them there, and they be his people. God used Moses. This is a leadership process to bring them up to the promised land. He was best at the Exodus and transitioning, Joshua was best at the conquest. So God changed there. There was succession, a very successful succession between Moses and Joshua. But if you look at the succession between Joshua and who else, there was not a good succession. It went downhill. This can be a time of renewal. And when you look at succession, there's three key players in a succession. There's the leader, there's the successor, and there's the organization. The leader, the successor, and the organization. And it really ought to be a time of renewal. And truly, there is no success without succession. Example, if Moses had kept wandering around the wilderness and never got to the promised land, would that have been a success? No, the Israelites would have been right. What did they accuse Moses of? You brought us out here to wander around in the wilderness to die. And he probably thought a lot of times, that ain't a bad idea. But he got them up to the promised land. And then God says, you've accomplished that aspect of the vision. Now, I want Joshua to move on. Let's talk about the leader. The leader must come to grips with the fact that the vision is God's vision, not the leader's. The organization is God's organization, not the leader's. And the selection of the successor is God's decision and not the leader's. It's a mouthful, but it's true. We get so personalized sometimes in our leadership that it's my organization. I'm going to choose the successor. But in reality, it's God's. It's not ours. It's God's. We are moving people onto God's agenda. We're trying to accomplish God's objective. That's why He put us in a position of leadership. So you've got to have the right perspective as a leader. So when do you start preparing for succession? The moment you take that leadership position. No leader, how gifted or talented, is indispensable. I had a boss once who stated this not very eloquently, but his expression was, okay, what if you step out and get hit by a beer truck? What's going to happen to what you're doing? Well, hopefully, Lord won't take me home by getting hit by a beer truck, even though it would be sort of humorous. But what's going to happen when we're gone? And we're not indispensable. I mean, God gave us the opportunity, chose us, allowed us to carry out this process. A leader's ability will not be judged by personal or organizational achievement during his tenure, but how well the followers and the organization do after he is gone. So the real success of a leader is not going to be as much while they're leading, but it's going to be when they're gone. What impact did they have? Did it still go on? And I've been in positions where it went really well after I was gone. And I've been in positions where it went to pot. And looking back, it was my fault because I did not prepare for succession. The leader contributes toward accomplishing God's objectives, but God may choose another leader to complete the project. Even though Moses trained Joshua, God chose Joshua. So let me ask you this question. Whatever you're doing right now, what's your exit strategy? What's going to happen when you're gone? Is it going to continue, or is it going to die with you? Let's talk about the organization. How do you prepare an organization for succession? The organization must be prepared from the start for the eventual transition of leadership. Now that seems strange, I know. Like particularly maybe a pastor goes to a church and you say, I want to prepare that church for the next pastor. Usually you're saying, I'm just trying to recoup from the last one. Or maybe if you're a manager in a corporation or you're a teacher, like, oh man, I'm trying to prepare this class for the next teacher. I'm just trying to take care of what happened from the last teacher. But that's where it starts, from the very beginning. The leader must shift, and how do you do that? You shift your focus from leading followers to developing leaders. That's the only way you can do it, folks, is you shift your focus from leading followers, making them dependent upon you, to developing leaders so that when you're gone, it goes on. You must make the organization as strong as possible by leading with the future in mind. The followers must be focused on the vision and not the leader. That's a lot said there. People will tend to focus on the leader. They truly will. That's why, again, using a church example, art works in the corporate world. When a new leader comes in, the folks are focused on that leader more so than they are on the whole vision of what you're trying to do. A leader must make investments in the organization now for success in the future by establishing a leadership development culture. Are you focusing on doing stuff or developing leaders? We've started focusing in our church on developing leaders. I love it. People are saying, y'all are spending so much time talking about leadership, we don't have any time to do anything. We're making progress. Because we're spending our time hoping to develop leaders rather than just doing stuff. Because you see, I ain't going to be here forever. When I'm gone, I want there to be leaders who can carry on, not because of me, but because they caught the vision, and they in turn are instilling that. Here's a sobering thought, and this is what I tell people in parenting. The success of parenting is not in the children, but in the grandchildren. Go, ooh, I preached that once in a church, and there's a lady, grandmother up on the front row. I could hear her sucking air from up in the pulpit, like, oh! I don't know whether it hurt or whether she thought I was a heretic or what, but truly, same thing in leadership. Because you can make kids do certain things, but when they get out on their own and they're starting to instill the same values in their kids that you try to instill in them, guess what? You're successful. I love it. I love it when my grandkids say things that I've said to their parents. It's like, wow. Not only did they hear it, not only did they accept it, but they now are passing that on down to their kids. Same thing with leadership. Now, let's talk about the successor. The successor in all cases must be supported by, and in a lot of cases prepared by, the leader. How do you prepare? How did Joshua get prepared by Moses? How did Moses prepare him? Well, here's something as a leader. A successful leader will work himself out of a job by investing in the development of emerging leaders to take his place. That's the same thing about parenting. What's the role of a parent? To work themselves out of a job. And that's a sort of a bittersweet thing, because it's like, they don't need me anymore. They don't need me anymore. We struggle with that with our kids. Like, well, they don't call. Well, they don't need us anymore. So we just adopted some more kids. Because you see, there's ways to invest in people, and that successful leader will try to unintentionally work himself out of a job. And you know, sometimes that's a little intimidating and a little threatening. I worked with an organization once with senior technical people. And they were generally older technical people. And what I found they were doing, they were taking the technical manuals and locking them up. Why? Because they didn't want these young guys knowing as much as they did. Seriously. They were locking up the technical manuals. So we had to, do work around on that. But see, what they saw was the people they were training as a threat. Now, let me give you a converse of that. As a leader, if you want to step up a level, you need to train somebody to take the place of where you are. Because I've seen a lot of people who were so good at what they did and never trained anybody else, they never got promoted because no one could do what they're doing. So it may be in your best interest also. An organization confidence in a successor can be initially enhanced. Now this is just a jump start. They're going to start at the hand level, but it can be enhanced by the leader's endorsement. And this is what Moses did to Joshua. Moses laid his hand upon him, and the children of Israel hearkened unto him, and he did as the Lord commanded Moses. So, what's the final gift a leader can give a successor? Is walk away and allow the successor to assume leadership. This can be probably one of the most difficult things a leader does, is walk away and leave the organization to the successor. That's like, this is my organization. But it can also be extremely satisfying because why? Because now I know I can leave and it continues. See, that's what's so good about parenting. And you see things in your grandkids. I've got a son that's in UAE. Got 2 great grandsons. He thinks they're his sons. They're my grandsons. But you see, I don't worry about that because I see him and his wife instilling. This is that progression of teaching men who can teach men. And so that's the same thing in every area, whether it's in the family or whether it's in an organization. So with that, we're back to where we started. We talked about purpose and importance of leadership. We defined leadership. We talked about qualifications of leaders. We talked about some promises and power. We talked about the process of leadership. We talked about some perils, some things that as a leader you're going to face. We talked about developing yourself and developing others. And then finally we talked about succession. So folks, this is not the end. This is the starting point. If you want to be a leader, my challenge to you is to learn. I've given you a good resource list to start. Read. In fact, you're being encouraged to get credit for the course by reading a couple of books. Start with that and then add some of these others. And go back and read the most important book on leadership, God's Word. And if you want the Cliff Notes, go to the book of Nehemiah because it sort of consolidates it there and then expand. So my hope and my prayer is that nothing can make me happier than to see you become leaders. And then you in turn teach others to become leaders. Because this is what it's all about. Let's close in a word of prayer. Father, we come to you. We acknowledge who you are. That, Father, we have the privilege and the opportunity. We don't understand why. We don't understand your thought process. But we know that you accomplish your kingdom and your will through people. Lord, through leaders. And Father, I just pray that you give us the wisdom, the discernment, and the understanding. Lord, give us the skills to be the leaders to carry out your will and your agenda. Father, I pray a special blessing on these that are hearing this. This is just a start. Lord, it's so many other things to learn, but Lord, it's a place to begin. And I pray, Father, that as your eyes look to and fro for men and women that will lead, that, Lord, you're looking on them now. In Christ's name, amen.